What could make an entire community turn against its own neighbors, friends, and even family? In 1692, the small village of Salem, Massachusetts, was gripped by fear so powerful that logic, compassion, and even faith were pushed aside. Within just a few months, over 200 people were accused of making a pact with the devil, and 19 were executed in front of crowds that believed they were watching pure evil at work. But the truth of what happened in Salem wasn't simply about witchcraft. It was about suspicion, jealousy, politics, and the dangerous power of hysteria. This is the story of how fear consumed Salem, and why the echoes of those trials still haunt us today. Puritan roots and tensions. To understand Salem in 1692, you have to first understand the people who lived there. The Puritans had crossed the Atlantic to build what they believed would be a pure, godly society. They lived by an unforgiving moral code, where even the smallest misstep could mean public humiliation in front of the congregation. Life was already harsh: brutal winters, constant fear of attacks, and the struggle to survive in an unfamiliar land. But inside the community, tensions were just as fierce. Salem itself was divided. Salem town thrived as a busy port, while Salem village, just a few miles away, was made up of struggling farmers who wanted independence from the town's influence. Arguments over land, wealth, and religious authority split neighbors apart. Even the choice of a minister could turn into a bitter fight. By the time Reverend Samuel Parris took the pulpit, the village was already on edge, and instead of calming disputes, he only added fuel to the fire. Parris preached with suspicion, pointing out sins and punishing harshly, deepening the divide. And as if the community wasn't fractured enough, the winter of 1691 was one of the harshest anyone could remember. Crops failed, food was scarce, and hope felt thinner than the icy air outside. Salem was a village waiting for a spark. The first strange fits that spark came from inside Reverend Samuel Parris's own household. In the cold winter of 1692, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail began to act in ways no one could explain. They screamed out in pain, contorted their bodies, and crawled under furniture as though invisible hands were dragging them down. They claimed to feel sharp pinches and pricks, as if unseen needles pierced their skin. A local physician was called, but he found nothing physically wrong. His chilling diagnosis: the girls were bewitched. Soon after, more children in the village began showing the same terrifying symptoms. For the tightly wound Puritans of Salem, already burdened by hunger, war, and endless disputes, this was the final push. If even the minister's own family wasn't safe from the devil's grip, then no one was. But the real horror wasn't in the fits themselves. It was in what came next, when the girls were asked to name who had cursed them, and the first accusations would change Salem forever. The first accusations. When the young girls were pressed to reveal who had bewitched them, their answers sent shockwaves through Salem. The first name they spoke was Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant. She was an easy target, an outsider, most likely from the Caribbean, with dark skin and foreign traditions that made her different in the eyes of the Puritans. But the accusations didn't stop there. Next came Sarah Good, a homeless woman who had lost everything after her father's death and her husband's debts. She often begged from neighbors just to survive, and her bitterness had earned her little sympathy. Then came Sarah Osborne, once wealthy but estranged from the powerful Putnam family after marrying an indentured servant and fighting to control her late husband's estate. To the villagers, she was seen as selfish and sinful. Tituba, under intense pressure, eventually confessed. She claimed she had been forced to sign the devil's book and that she had seen other names written inside. Her words gave the hysteria legitimacy and gave the courts a reason to keep her alive as a witness. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, however, were not so lucky. The accusations against them marked the beginning of a storm that no one in Salem could escape. But this was only the start. Soon accusations spread beyond the easy targets, reaching into the very heart of Salem's church and community. Spectral evidence and escalation. Once the accusations began, they spread like wildfire. What made it even more dangerous was the type of evidence the courts allowed. The judges accepted something called spectral evidence, claims that a witch's spirit or specter had attacked someone in a dream or vision. If a girl collapsed in court and screamed that she saw an accused person's ghost choking her, that was treated as proof. No witnesses, no physical signs, just the word of frightened children. At first, the targets had been outsiders and the poor, but then the hysteria turned inward. Martha Corey, a respected member of the church, was accused after she dared to question the credibility of the girls. Then came Rebecca Nurse, Alice, a deeply religious and admired woman in the community. If women like them could be witches, then no one was safe. Fear gripped every household, because any misstep, feud, or suspicion could turn into an accusation. What had started as a strange illness in a minister's home was now a frenzy tearing Salem apart, and soon the trials would no longer just be about accusations. They would be about executions. Executions begin by June of 1692. Salem's court of oyer and termina, literally meaning to hear and determine, was in full swing. The very first to face the gallows was Bridget Bishop, a woman accused of living outside the strict Puritan code. She wore bright clothing, ran a tavern, and was considered far too independent. For the Puritans, this was enough to mark her as suspicious. On June 10th, she was hanged before a crowd that believed they were watching justice. But Bridget was only the beginning. Within weeks, Sarah Good, one of the very first accused, was also sentenced to death. She was hanged on July 19th, along with 4 other women. Before her execution, she stood defiant, cursing the judges and declaring that God would give them blood to drink. Her fury echoed long after her death. The trials reached their most dramatic point on August 19th, when Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was condemned. As the rope tightened around his neck, Burroughs shocked the crowd by flawlessly reciting the Lord's Prayer. Many believed that witches could not speak those holy words. For a moment, doubt swept through the spectators, but the execution went forward anyway. This act planted the first real seeds of resistance. If even a minister could be hanged, then perhaps the devil wasn't the only power at work in Salem. The death of Giles Corey. Among the many accused was Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. When charged with witchcraft, Giles refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty. Under the law, this meant he couldn't be tried. But refusing to speak carried a terrible price. The court ordered that Corey be subjected to a punishment called pressing. He was stripped naked, laid on the ground, and heavy boards were placed on his chest. One by one, massive stones were stacked on top of him, slowly crushing the life from his body. For 3 agonizing days, Corey endured the torture in silence. Witnesses recalled that when the sheriff demanded a plea, his only words were chillingly defiant, "More weight." Each time, the sheriff obliged, piling on heavier stones. At last, Corey was crushed to death. His sacrifice was not in vain. By refusing to plead, he ensured that his property would not be seized by the courts, leaving his estate intact for his sons to inherit. In Salem's darkest days, Giles Corey became a symbol of courage and resistance, even as the executions continued. Collapse of the trials. By the fall of 1692, the fear that had fueled Salem's witch hunt was finally beginning to break down. The execution of Reverend George Burroughs had already shaken public confidence, but the brutal death of Giles Corey pushed it even further. People began to wonder, if a minister could pray perfectly, and if a man could die so honorably, could the courts really be trusted? The tipping point came when accusations reached into the highest levels of society. Even the wife of Governor William Phipps was named as a suspected witch. That was enough. Phipps, who had only recently taken office, moved to shut down the special court of oyer and termina. On October the 29th, 1692, the trials were officially halted. In total, 19 people were executed. 5 more died in prison, and over 200 were accused, nearly 10% of the region's population. What had begun with the strange behavior of a few young girls had ended in one of the largest outbreaks of mass hysteria in American history. But the story of Salem didn't end there. The real question was why it happened, and the theories that followed are just as chilling as the trials themselves. Theories and legacy. When the dust settled, Salem was left with more questions than answers. Why had so many been so quick to believe the impossible? For centuries, the most common explanation was simple. The girls lied. And once the lies grew too large, they couldn't stop. Family feuds and village rivalries only poured fuel on the fire. But other theories have surfaced. Some historians suggest that the children may have truly believed what they were experiencing, their imaginations warped by fear, strict religious teaching, and the pressure of living under constant suspicion. Others point to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye bread, capable of causing convulsions and hallucinations. It's even the same source used to create LSD. Could spoiled grain have triggered the terrifying fits that started it all? We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is that Salem became a warning. The trials revealed how quickly fear can silence reason, how suspicion can be weaponized, and how hysteria can destroy destroy entire communities. It wasn't the last time this happened either. Echoes of Salem can be found in later moments of American history, from McCarthyism in the 1950s to more recent waves of public panic. The lesson endures: when fear takes hold, it can turn neighbor against neighbor and truth into tragedy. Salem's ghosts remind us how fragile justice can be when ruled by hysteria instead of reason. Conclusion: the Salem Witch Trials began with whispers in a minister's home, but they ended with a community scarred by grief, guilt, and regret. 19 people were executed, countless others imprisoned, and the village's trust in itself was shattered. It wasn't witches that destroyed Salem. It was fear, suspicion, and the dangerous power of hysteria. Looking back, the trials remind us that truth can be drowned out when panic rules the day. What happened in 1692 wasn't just about a distant past. It's a warning about what can happen anytime fear spreads faster than reason. Salem teaches us how fragile justice can be, and how important it is to question, to doubt, and to think before condemning. Because if it could happen in a small Puritan village more than 3 centuries ago, it can happen anywhere, at any time, unless we learn from Salem's darkest chapter. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. The Salem Witch Trials show us just how quickly fear can take control, and how costly it can be when truth is ignored. If you found this story as eye-opening as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next dive into history's mysteries. And let me know in the comments, what do you think truly fueled the hysteria in Salem? I'll be reading your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the past still has lessons for us all.